Hi, everybody. Today's Tuesday, October 7th, 2025, and our dear friend Colonel Jacques Baud is here with us. Welcome, Colonel.
Thank you very much for having me. Sorry not to have been available yesterday, but that's very fine today. So,
Great to have you. Colonel, let me start. Today marks October 7th, October the 7th, what has happened in Palestine, the attack and Hamas attack on Israelis, and then the Israeli ongoing genocide in Gaza. And if you were to compare Israel and its position before all this madness, started, and today, the position of Israel militarily, politically, do you think that what Israel has done so far has put Israel in a better position, in a stronger position?
no, definitely not. I mean, Israel, and I think this is an easy question in reality. Um, it has today Israel is economically weak, and it has lost a lot of allies. A lot of people who had some respect for Israel have now lost this respect for Israel. A lot of companies have cut their ties with Israel because it's never good to have business with a country that is performing a genocide. This is not good for business, and that's the reason why a lot of companies have simply cut their ties with Israel. The um, the international community now realizes that something that existed before. So it's also very important to realize that what the 7th of October has realized was to, in fact, make apparent something that was already ongoing. It has just accelerated the movement, if you want. But in reality, everything we have seen in the Gaza Strip since the 7th of October 2023, that was already happening before. And by the way, that's the reason why the 7th of October happened, is that because those people in the Gaza Strip were fed up with what was going on. And they also realized that the international community was not paying any attention to that. And that's the rationale behind the 7th of October, was to make things apparent. And it's related to a lot of different things. I mean, we talk always about Gaza, but in reality, remember that the operation on the 7th of October was called the Al-Aqsa flood. Al-Aqsa is the mosque which is on the so-called Temple Mount, Mount of the Temple in Jerusalem. I mean, Mount of Temple is the Jewish application name, but I don't remember the name in Arabic. I think it's Jebel Haram or something like that. In any case, that's the second holy place, or the third, if you take the two first in Saudi Arabia, but the third holy place for the Muslims in the world. And this holy place is threatened by the intent by those guys like Ben Gvir and all the people, his followers, who wants to rebuild the third temple of Solomon, meaning that they need to destroy this mosque of Al-Aqsa. And so, of course, we are talking about what's happening in Gaza, but in reality, what affected the Palestinian population in Palestine was not simply what was in Gaza, but also the whole Muslim heritage in Palestine. Because if you had the destruction of the mosque on the Mount of Temple, that would definitely be something that would affect not just only the people in Gaza, but also affect the Muslim culture at large and the Palestinian culture at large. So you had a lot of different events that, in fact, converged And that's the reason why, by the way, when I started to write the book on this operation. I gave the name afterwards, because but I started to write the book already in the spring 2023, because I realized that the tension was mounting and was becoming extremely tense, and that could, without any question, leads to a very strong confrontation between Palestinians and the Israel. So we tend to represent what happened 3 years ago as an event just like this, decided by the Hamas. That in reality, this is only the consequence of a sequence of events that nobody paid attention for in the West, but they were there. They affected the Palestinians. Palestinians were already killed before the 7th of October. Palestinians were massacred before the 7th of October. People were taken as hostage by the Israelis before the 7th of October. And that's precisely, by the way, as you had negotiation at the end of had negotiation since 2021 about all the situation of those hostages taken by the Israel. When I say hostages, we have to be very careful with the words. And I use the word very carefully here, because if you arrest someone who has committed a crime, then this person is arrested, period. He's a criminal. He gets arrested. He gets judgment, and he goes in jail or something like that. But here we are not talking about this. We are talking about individuals, and namely kids, women's, elderlies, whoever, who are taken by Israeli and put into camps or jail for the simple sake of exerting a pressure on the family of those people. So these are effectively hostages. There is no judgment. There is no, they don't know why they are taken. They are simply taken in order to make pressure on their families. And that's the problem. And at the time at the end of the 21, I mean, in 21-22, you had several thousands of these people. And the Hamas, through intermediaries, started to have a negotiation about these people and tried to find a way to liberate those persons. And that's exactly why, because at one point the new government led by Netanyahu broke the discussion and said, stopped completely the dialogue, and said, now we don't talk anymore to you. And that's exactly why the Hamas decided to take some militaries in the so-called Gaza envelope. The Gaza envelope is this area around it's a militarized zone around Gaza, where you have the so-called Gaza division. The Gaza division is it's a military entity composed by several brigades that was exclusively devoted to confining the people in the Gaza Strip. So basically, they had all these surveillance towers around the Gaza Strip with those watchtowers, automatic firing systems. I mean, machine guns. They were manned by distance. I mean, remote controlled machine guns and things like this, and they were all around the Gaza Strip. And it was forbidden for the people in Gaza to get close to the border of their own territory. So a big part of their own territory was not even accessible, because this was prevented by these automatic watch systems, drones, and you had those balloons. I mean, those spy balloons that were deployed around the Gaza Strip that allowed to have a vision electronic surveillance, but also optic surveillance on the whole Gaza Strip. So basically, this was really an open air prison. That was exactly that. And in order to resume the dialogue, the Hamas decided to make this operation, the Al Aqsa flood operation, to catch those people in the Gaza envelope, in this militarized zone, in order to have um, a way of pressure on the government to reopen negotiation. That was the idea of this Al Aqsa flood operation. And since the people in this militarized zone are essentially military personnel, and since Gaza is is a territory which is occupied, and since the UN resolution authorized armed resistance against the occupation, this is the reason why I'm very adamant to say that those people who were abducted or taken by the Hamas on the 7th of October are not hostages, because they are people who were, in fact, performing a military occupation of a territory. They were part of an occupation force, period. So it's war. That's also the reason why it becomes extremely difficult if you look at this. And that's the reason why nobody wants to tell, and they have a lot of effort in the international community to say that Gaza was not occupied because you had no troops inside Gaza. But in reality, and that was confirmed not only by the United Nations, but also by the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is the entity which is responsible for the implementation of the Geneva Conventions, um, on the issue of civilians during war and things like that. These organizations have confirmed that regardless of where the Israeli soldiers were physically, they were exerting an occupation of the Gaza Strip, because they limit the activity. They decide what kind of activity can be performed by the people in Gaza or no. And therefore, Gaza was, in fact, as I said before, an open air prison, literally, for civilians and non-civilians. If we take the combatants, and the combatants, we always talk about the Hamas, but in fact, you have something like 16 or 18, depending how you count, a different resistance organization. And the operation that was launched on the 7th of October was not a Hamas operation, even if the Hamas was the leading organization and all that. But in reality, it's a joint operation of those 18 armored groups, in fact, representing not just Islamists as we tend to portray them, but a wide range of organizations that have, some of them are Marxists, some of them are Shiite, because you have a Shiite minority in Gaza. Some others are Islamists. Some others are close to the Fatah organization. So it's an extremely wide range of organizations that are fighting. We always talk about the Hamas, but in reality, and it's a distortion of the reality, because the whole name of the game is to say that Israel is legitimate to fight Islamist terrorism. That's the whole purpose of all the narrative that you have around what's happening in Gaza. But this is factually wrong. This is a fallacy. that is only here in order to justify the violence, because, as Netanyahu himself said many times, when people asked him why he would target civilians, he said, well, but the West has done the same in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. You see, and us, that's also the reason why, since the early 2000s, in fact, since the 11th of September 2001, you had the Israeli leadership, and Netanyahu specifically, who tried to tell that Hamas was part of this Al Qaeda movement, if you want, this kind of Islamist movement that affected the whole West at the time. And there was a strong idea, and that comes also in the kind of logic that we have. That's very strong in France, by the way, in Europe at large, but especially in France and in the US, to say, for instance, that the Hamas is part of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood is part of this wide Islamist movement that aims at destroying the Christian world and things like this. Whereas, if you study properly, I mean, factually, what happened, the Hamas is a breakaway of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's not a part of the Brotherhood. That's precisely why it separated from it. You have a Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan, you have Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, Muslim Brotherhood in Turkey, Muslim Brotherhood elsewhere in the world. But here, and I mean, I use the word Muslim Brotherhood in country XYZ because that's the way they call themselves. This is the name of the organization. That's the one we had in Syria, in Turkey, in Jordan, in Egypt. This is always Muslim Brotherhood in blah, blah, blah. But you have no Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine. We have to be very careful. I studied very carefully all these. I mean, in my book on how to fight jihadi terrorists, terrorism, I studied all these groups. And in my book, Governing by Fake News, the one which is behind me here, I studied also very carefully what happened in Syria during the 2011 up to 2017. This is what is covered in my book here, and I studied also the logos of this movement, how they evolved, and you can see, because the logo is not simply something like this. It's not just marketing. It reflects also what you want to show, what you want to fight for. And you can see by studying the logo of some movement, resistance or violent or Islamist or jihadi movement or whatever you want to call them. When you study them, you see that you can see some allegiance in the way the logo is designed, because that reflects the allegiance to some other movement. In any case, the Hamas has a completely separate approach, and it's not Muslim Brotherhood. It's separated from Muslim Brotherhood. And then when you start studying seriously, not simply as some propagandists have done, and most, in fact, have written, because there have been studies about those who write about terrorism, and you can see that about 70% of what you read is in fact just recycled information. That means that everybody repeats what another one said. They don't know, they haven't made studies. And a lot of document you see, even from official intelligence services, for instance, is not the result of a specific study of the case or the movement. It's mostly you just cherry pick what you want to say, and you take it from some scholars or people who don't know anything about terrorism. They don't know anything about Muslim mentality. They don't know anything about what's the objective of the struggle in this country, this and so on and so forth. In any case, meaning that our understanding of Muslim terrorism is extremely distorted. By the way, that's one of the explanation why we are not able to be effective against Muslim or jihadi or Islamist terrorism, because we don't even try to understand them. We also will always go with this logic that a good terrorist is a dead terrorist. But this is not the way it goes. And by the way, the assertion that a good terrorist is a dead terrorist is exactly what feeds the terrorism. And that's the asymmetric side of the conflict. But only a few people understand that. In any case, that was an effort from the Israeli government since about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, to equate jihadi terrorism and Hamas terrorism. And that's totally different. I mean, Muslim Brotherhood and a lot of, not all of them, but a lot of jihadi movement, especially in Syria, fought fought for the idea of Islamism. That's typically what you had with the Islamic State, for instance. They had this idea that it needed an Islamic State, and therefore this was this very idea that was the main motivation. The Muslim, I mean, in Palestine, it's absolutely not the case. They don't really care about having a jihadi type of government or things like that. This is about the liberation of their territory. And we have also to understand, because there is a logic behind this. And as I said many times, there is not a single square meter of Israel, of the Israeli state, if you want. There is not a single square meter that has been acquired legally by Israel. The United Nations never gave any single square meter to Israel. Every single square meter has been taken by violence. Every single square meter. None were given to Israel, as they tend to portray it. And I remind you that the whole issue of the resolution 181 of November 1947, when the UN General Assembly proposed the idea of having two states, I mean, one Jewish state and one Arab state. This is the terminology that was used then. The idea was to achieve that through referendum. That was the idea, and you can read the resolution. This is absolutely clearly said. The problem is that since you had a majority of Arab at that time in Palestine, the Jews preferred to use violence because they were better prepared for violence than the Arabs were. Because most of the Jews you had at that time in Palestine were in fact former combatants from World War II who fought in the Jewish brigade of the British Army or things like that. And therefore they were better ready for war. And in the Palestinians, I mean, the Palestinian population at that time were mostly people, I mean, they were just farmer or they were herders, and they had absolutely no real idea of fighting. And for that reason, it was very easy within the 6 months that happened between November 1947 and May 1948. It was easy for the Jews to take over the whole country. But when the very day when the Israelis decided to make this conquest a fait accompli, by declaring independence on the 14th of May 1948, that's exactly what triggered the first Arab war. I mean, Israeli Arab war, because then they said, no, that's not the way it should go. The Arabs were still struggling to have a referendum, and the British played a very nasty role in that by avoiding organizing the referendum, because in fact they had the authority on this territory. I mean, the Palestine was a country that can be compared to the New Caledonia in today, which is under the authority of France. This is one of the 17 territories recognized by the UN with a limited sovereignty, meaning that these are states with authorities and all that, but they are under the a kind of a mandatory power. New Caledonia is an example, a case in point, where you have a French administration, but New Caledonia is not French territory. Even if the French, even in France, people don't really realize this. But New Caledonia has nothing to do with France, basically, apart the fact that they are under French rule, but this is a delegated authority. And you had exactly the same thing in Palestine. Palestine was a state, definitely. It was a state, but it was under the administration, I mean, British administration, meaning that in 1947, when the resolution was issued by the General Assembly, the British administration should have coordinated with those entities in Palestine, both Arab and Jewish entities that were, because you had an administration that was shared between Jews and Arabs. And if you look at the documents, I don't know, I don't have them here, but I could probably show you a document of the government of Palestine. It's written both in English, Arabic, and Hebrew. And instead of organizing or creating the conditions to have the referendum that would have led to a peaceful solution of the problem, the British didn't do anything. As a result, they let the Israelis take the country, the whole country over through violence. And that's the reason why the Palestinians have never accepted, not even Israel, because the state of Israel we have today is in fact a territory that is not legal. This is the reality. And that's the reason why you can understand that the Jews, I mean, up to the the Oslo agreement in 1993, when Yasser Arafat decided to recognize the state of Israel. And that's also the reason why you had the split with other organizations such as the Hamas and others, who said, well, but who give you the authority to recognize a state? Because this state has taken all the territory it has without any single exception. That was a territory that was taken by violence. Therefore, this is the legitimacy and the legality of Israel is still questioned. In addition to the fact that, as we know, and that it was decided the day before the Declaration of Independence in May 1948, Israel decided not to define their borders because they had in mind that they would expand. And that's the reason why when we talk about a greater Israel and all that, this is based on the fact that Israel has never established formally its own borders. And the borders we use when we see on the map, the maps that you have on Google Maps, whatever, these are not official borders. They are just tolerated. In fact, it's the armistice border of 1949, at the end of the First Arab War. That was still valid up to early June 1967. But in reality, Israel has no recognized border, not even recognized by himself, by the way. So that makes the whole Israel a territory which is illegal in essence, that has never managed or never demonstrated its willingness to join, let's say, if I can say it that way, to join the international community in the sense of the legal side of the international community. And you have, by the way, if you look at all the resolutions that have been taken since 1948 by the United Nations, they all remind people about all these facts. You see, what I'm saying is something that is well written and recalled in any resolution about Israel since 1948. But the problem is that nobody really reads those resolutions. Even scholars, when they talk about this resolution 181 of November 1947, they never read the resolution. Otherwise, they would realize that Israel has no legal base. And we are satisfied with this idea that on the 14th of May 1948, the Arabs decided that they reject the plan for the UN. It's totally wrong. The Arab were in favor of the application of the resolution. And in fact, if what the position was at that time, I mean, in November 1947, this was the Jews wanted their own territory. So that because of World War II, because of all that. In any case, we can probably understand that. In any case, they wanted their own territory, period. While and therefore a kind of a two-state solution, if you want. While the Arabs wanted one country, one state with two nations. So and that's, if you read the charter of the Hamas, for instance, this has remained exactly that. They say exactly that. They say we want one country with two nations. It's exactly that. But that was not in their charter of 1986. But the new charter they have published in 2017 clearly said so. It was not so clear in the previous one, but now it has been clarified, and it is so. The problem is that, you see, and it's all about narrative, because even the charter, the Hamas charter of 2017, is never quoted by people. They always talk about the 1986 charter, because there it's obviously more the tone and the vocabulary and the wording used is extremely, it's closer to Islamist vocabulary, definitely. When you read the charter of 2017, after the fact that Hamas decided to abandon terrorism and to go into a more political direction, exactly what the same move that Yasser Arafat made in 1974, when he decided to stop terrorism and engage into a more political line. And that's exactly what the Hamas has done in 2017. I mean, it had done that before, but this has been formalized in the Charter of 2017. In fact, we can say that since the early 2000s, I would say roughly since the Hamas is in charge of the Gaza Strip, we can say that Hamas has renounced to terrorist action. And in fact, it's very difficult. We don't see, we barely can find any terrorist act in since 2005. Because again, when we talk about terrorist organization, we need to define this, and that's the word terrorism is misused by the West and of course by Israel in order to justify violence against the country. And that's exactly what we have. We have always the same rhetoric to say, well, if you say, well, you are using violence against civilians, Netanyahu said, well, but you do the same, you did the same in Iraq and Syria and Libya and elsewhere. So what are we doing more wrong than you did?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I think you described it in a very comprehensive way. Many people, I think, many of us would want you to go to the UN. I think you're gonna address the situation in Palestine in a proper way. It's amazing the way that you describe it, Colonel. It's gonna
Well,
be obvious.
I'm simply, I was in charge of the peacekeeping operations. I mean, I was responsible for the doctrine, policy and doctrine in the Department of Peacekeeping Operations for 2 years in the General Secretariat in New York for the UN. And I'm used to read those resolutions. I'm used to understand what is behind the wording that is used. And when I started to really study the conflict in Palestine, I went into the original texts that you have in the UN General Assembly and all that, and I discovered a fantastic discrepancy between the texts and what the UN says and what we say, and even what scholars say, which is surprising because I don't trust very much the journalists and the media when it comes to Ukraine, Iran, Palestine, and other conflict. You cannot trust them because they are simply telling what the establishment wants them to tell. So yeah, they are parrots. That's it. They're just parroting politicians. So no interest. But I would have expected from scholars and people who have some more education than journalists, have like legal education, that are used to read those resolutions. I expected from them to have a more factual approach to this conflict because it when you read and what you see what's happening in the media, it has become extremely emotional. And again, this is exactly like Ukraine and Russia and others. When you are involved in a conflict, of course, it takes an emotional dimension. I understand that from Palestinians, from Israelis, from others. The problem is that again, when you are an outsider, when you have the luxury of being out of the conflict, and especially in my case, who comes from a neutral country, in addition to that, but when you have this privilege of being out of the conflict, not having family involved in the conflict in any way, that you should have a honest understanding of that. You should make every effort to understand the position of all the actors, not siding arbitrarily with one or the other. And my personal education, the education I received, my military education, but also my intelligence education, prevents me, forbids me to take side arbitrarily with one actor or the other. And that's the reason why today, of course, it's easy. You say, well, you're conspiracy theorist, you're pro Palestinian, you're pro Russian, you become pro whatever. But the reality is that since the narrative is so biased, so misoriented, that anything you can say to try to reestablish some kind of truth, to come back to the facts, even coming back to the facts becomes something that's, say, pro Russian, pro Palestinian, pro whoever. But the reality is that if scholars would do their job properly, intellectually, honestly, we wouldn't have this problem. But even scholars are not honest. And that's why we I mean, probably not all of them, but I have read hundreds of authors of articles on the I have a huge library of documents related to these conflicts, because I have studied. I focus not just on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but more on the issue of terrorism. But in order to understand the context of terrorism, you have to understand what is the context of the conflict in itself. So, because you cannot just study terrorism outside of a context. It has to be understood in a context. And that's why I could define different type of terrorism with different strategies to address terrorism. You cannot fight terrorism in. I mean, if I were Israeli, I would certainly not fight terrorism the way they do it. Even if I'm not even agree with the word terrorism, but it's another issue. But assuming that you use the word terrorism for Hamas, I would certainly not fight as they do. Other kind of terrorism can be fought the way they do, but not this one. And that's exactly the mistake that the Americans have done in I mean, not just the Americans primarily, but the Westerners at large. When fighting terrorism, we tend to have one size fits all. Everything is hidden behind the word terrorism. It's a terrorist, and therefore everything is allowed. In reality, you have to understand that there are asymmetric terrorists, some forms of terrorism who are asymmetric, some who are not asymmetric. You have symmetric forms of terrorism, and that must not be addressed the same way. But the problem is that if you don't start to understand the very nature of what you are fighting against, you are not you are bound to fail. And that's exactly what happens. I mean, a lot of these incident or attack we had, especially I'm living in Belgium, and the what we had in Belgium in 2016, we had several attacks here in Brussels. But I would say that all that could have been very easily prevented. But since the Belgian police and the intelligence didn't understand the threat, they created the problem. Literally, they created the problem. We could have avoided that. The same as the French could have avoided what happened in 2015. But since they didn't try to even to understand the threat, they created the problem, and they not even created the problem, but they led the way they responded led to an amplification of the problem. And that's why in warfare there is one rule you cannot avoid, regardless of how strong you are, how whatever you are. There is one rule you cannot avoid: to understand your adversary.
Yeah.
Failing to do so leads you to failure. And that explains why the US failed in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria. I mean, they maintain an illusion of strength by keeping forces where I mean, they keep forces in some place like Syria, for instance. But are they really winning? Did they win something? Did they gain something? Nothing. Libya, same thing. It's a total failure for A to Z. And that and the French in Mali and Niger. I mean, the whole, in fact, the whole Sahel region where you had the Barkhane operation was a total failure, because by not knowing the adversary, you cannot establish a sound strategy to address the problem. And that's exactly what the Israelis are the worst. It's funny because a lot of people think that the Israelis are extremely effective against terrorism. They're effective to kill people. This is certainly so. It's probably the people who has the most experience in killing others, but they are not experienced in winning. And in fact, this is the only country in the world that, in fact, never managed to control a resistance movement in almost 80 years. Every other country in the world has managed to solve the problem they had in their country somehow. I mean, with variation and all that. I mean, it's not as smooth as I can explain it. But I used to make an encyclopedia of political violence, and with I listed, I don't know how, thousands of um, it's in French, unfortunately, but I've listed thousands of violent movements, mostly political, but not only, and described their doctrine and all that. So I've studied violence in South America, Central America, North America, Europe, Africa, and so on. I have been myself involved in discussion with those armed movements, especially in Africa and in Central Asia. In any case, uh, my experience is that all these movements must be addressed in a different way. There is not a single solution that you can be inspired by the solution, but you can never apply one to one a solution to another group. And that means that you need to have an extremely good understanding of those movements, and that applies to Israel as well. Israel has never managed to understand what's happening in Palestine because they are overconfident over themselves, and therefore they were so overconfident that they are winning, that they are the best, and they are the superior race. Then they never even tried to understand what their adversary was, and therefore they will always have the problem. And the whole issue, in fact, has culminated with what we see in Gaza. That even in Gaza, where everything has been turned into rubbles, when you have two brigades that are moving around in Gaza, that you have not a single building standing, they are still not managing to control the territory. And the Palestinians are still managing to control it. And more than this, the Palestinians have achieved something that the Israelis have not achieved, is to gain world support for what they are doing, which is something that when you said what has changed since the 7th of October, it's exactly that. Israel has lost credibility, has lost the trust we had in it, has lost the respect we had in it. Now we have everything that has been exposed. And probably the Palestinians have suffered a lot of casualties and fatalities. There's no doubt about this. But politically, the Palestinians have gained a lot, and they gain the support of the whole population, to the point that today we have a lot of people who, in fact, consider that Israeli equals Jew, meaning that even Jews in our countries are considered as pro-Israelis. They are despised, all of them. Meaning what we call anti-Semitism has become this, and also here the rhetoric at the beginning was try to blur the line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, which in fact is something that is clearly defined. I mean, anti-Semitism is about being against or hating someone who is Jew. So it's hating, in essence, it's hating someone because of what he is. While anti-Zionism is hating someone who has a policy, and Zionism being a policy or a doctrine or an ideology, if you want. So, in essence, anti Zionism is not hating what the people is, but what people do. And because the narrative that was very strongly um, encouraged in the West, especially, that when you try to criticize Israel or what Israel was doing, it was considered as anti-Semitism. So we blurred the border between hating what people are and what people do. But today, because the Israelis have blurred this line, everybody considers that those who support Israel basically deserve to be hated equally. As a result, there is no longer anti Semitism, I think, as we had probably 100 years ago. It's no longer that, but now it's anti Zionism. That means people are hating Israel because what it does. And those who support Israel are considered as supporter of the action of Israel. As a result, we hate them not because what they are, but because what they do. And this is a very interesting evolution in the whole thing. And this is initially the Israeli tried to do that to hide. Israel was hidden behind the Jewish community, if you want, by using the word anti-Semitism. But today, since the Jews at large were used to justify what Israel was doing, then today everybody is considered as a Zionist or pro-Zionist, and therefore everybody is hated not for what he is, but for what he does. And that's, I think, an evolution that is quite interesting, because, and it explains also why today, for instance, you have what you never had before in, I mean, you probably had this probably in the 30s in Germany or something like that. I mean, but since World War II, you are no longer this kind of behavior what we have seen this during the summer, when you had Israeli tourists in Europe and coming in the restaurant, and in the restaurant the guy said, "No, I don't serve you. You go out of my restaurant. I'm not serving people who kill children and women." You had never that before. So meaning that Israel has lost a lot in the image, not just the image of Israel, which has definitely suffered, but the image of the Jewish people has equally suffered very strongly. And it has exposed a lot of other things that are probably not, obviously not directly related to what you have in Palestine. But for instance, Epstein, Weinstein, all these cases, and you find always, and there are several cases in France where you find always the same names and always the same people. So today, all that has been merged into a picture that we have of the Jewish community that, in fact, has been revealed through what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians. You see, and it's very strange that the Israelis have not realized this. I mean, we have seen just recently, I mean, you had the Sumud flotilla, and the boat were boarded by the Israeli Navy, and people were arrested and all that. So, and again, the legality of this in international waters is heavily questioned. So that's the first step. But also, this is something very important, because then that underlines and reveals that Israel doesn't care about international law. And instead of trying to solve the problem peacefully, no, they didn't do that. And they even did worse. I'm not a great fan of Greta Thunberg, to be honest. But she was
Yeah.
there. She was there, and she had the courage to be there, and she was arrested. Now, the Israelis tried to humiliate her by wrapping her into the Israeli flag and humiliate her publicly with Ben Gvir. You know, I'm not a fan of Greta Thunberg. I said it, and this is definitely. But when I see that, suddenly I have more respect for Greta Thunberg than for those who take advantage of a young lady and try to humiliate in public a young lady. Because those who do that, regardless of their nationality, regardless of who they are, and the one who does this is for me someone that just that is despicable. There is no other understanding. This person don't deserve any kind of respect because you don't do that, even with your enemy. My culture is, and I'm colonel, and even as commander of elite unit, you respect your enemy. You fight him, you may kill him, but you respect him. And the way the Israeli do with their enemies is something that shows that, if you don't, I have no compassion whatsoever, past, present, or future, for a people that kills children, women, and elderlies. I have no compassion whatsoever. Israelis have lost the compassion I had because I was educated with this idea that we should have compassion for the Jews because of what they suffered during World War II. I've totally lost that compassion because I cannot have compassion for those who kill children. They don't deserve it. And I think when you see the way they behave with their prisoners, the way they try to humiliate their prisoner, what you don't see on the Palestinian side, by the way, we see that the prisoners that have been released by the Palestinians are grateful to the Palestinians. They thank them. They have been treated as humans by the Palestinians. And that's where you see the greatness of a people. It's the way he treated his enemy. When you start treating your enemy like animals, as it was often openly said by the Israelis, they qualify themselves. You don't need to go further. The real anti-Semitic are these Israelis themselves. They are the real anti-Semites.
Exactly. Yeah.
Anyway, so
Yeah. I think you're totally on point, Carl. And before wrapping up, Carl, we had the Valdai conference in which Vladimir Putin talked about the situation in Ukraine on the battlefield, and he was asked about Tomahawk missiles. He responded, and there are people somehow criticizing him that he wasn't that much powerful in the way that he was warning the West about sending Tomahawk missiles. But it seems the tone in Europe is somehow different from what we've heard from Ursula von der Leyen. Here is what she said, Carl.
Is that our adversaries are not only ready to exploit any divisions, they are actively inciting those divisions in the first place. And look at what happened in Sochi just last week, where Putin gave his annual Valdai Club speech. We should listen very carefully to his words. He put the blame on Europe for his continued war of aggression in Ukraine. He crowed about what he coined as the cracks of the edifice of Europe and the shaken unity within our union. He's not hiding his contempt for our union and the foundations it is built on, and he is not hiding his glee and support for all of his obedient friends in Europe who are doing his work for him. This is the oldest trick in the book. Sow division, spread disinformation, create a scapegoat, all to turn Europeans against each other, to try to lower our guard while we fight each other, to weaken our resolve and our resilience. This is a trap, and we simply cannot fail for it.
Yeah, she says that Putin, the main goal of Putin is just dividing countries in Europe and making differences and bolding their differences, is somehow trying to, manipulate the situation in favor of Russia. But after all, when you look at the conflict in Ukraine, you see the conflict itself is bringing these differences to the European Union, to the countries within the European Union, because they don't see there are many countries in Europe. I cannot say many countries, but there are few countries in Europe. They don't feel that they want the conflict in Ukraine. They want to go against Russia. There are countries that somehow they don't feel that much hate against Russia. And we see the western part of Europe, it's specifically I'm talking about the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, totally against. We had Merz talking the same way as Ursula von der Leyen is talking about. Who is Putin to Europe? Does really these problems that Europe is facing right now is because of Russia and what Putin is doing, or it's because of the reality of Europe today and what they've done to themselves in Europe?
Well, it's a multi-level problem. Answering your question about what is the cause of Europe's problems, if you just take the case of energy, for instance, of course, it's easy to say that because the Western Europe stopped any import of cheap energy from Russia, energy has become a problem for industrial production in the West because it has become more expensive. But in fact, this is true, but it's not the only reason. We tend to ignore that the policy of the EU regarding energy started well before the 2022. And the effort, what do you had of the Greens and all that in Europe contributed to to raise the price of energy, to weaken the offer of energy in Europe, and that was simply aggravated by the situation with Russia. But in reality, if you look at the problem, let's say holistically, you would see that this problem is the result of failed policies that we started since Ursula von der Leyen is there, even before the conflict in Ukraine. The conflict of Ukraine was just an additional a step towards the weakening of Europe. I would even say that the conflict with Russia has become kind of an alibi for the wrong policies that had been adopted before. And when you see the whole problem in France, for instance, where even before 2022, the energy has increased in price because of the European policies, nothing else. I mean, in France, you have basically, you had a system that was able to produce very cheap energy, but somehow, because of EU regulation, they managed to have a system that just raised the price of energy. When you add to this what happened with Russia, meaning that the whole issue with Europe And not just that, but the whole, we have seen, for instance, policy of Europe towards the US, for instance, with the Trump, this failed Trump, European Trump agreement. We can see this is not about the Russians. This is simply because Miss von der Leyen or Mrs. von der Leyen and the team she has there are not wise people, to say the least. I would even say these are rather stupid people. And they are not able to anticipate problem. They see problem from an ideological point of view, but not from a factual point of view. These are people moving around without objectives and hence without strategy. That's exactly what we have seen. I mean, with the European Union, with Ukraine, for instance, there is no objective, there is no strategy. They want to weaken Russia, yes, but what does it mean concretely? What do you want to achieve concretely? You want to have Ukraine winning. Okay, what does it mean today? How do you define victory? What once you have defined it, what can you make in order to achieve this objective? And we see that since the very beginning, the beginning of the special military operation, nobody has defined this in Europe. I mean, when we talk, and recently, it's very interesting, by the way, that recently, just yesterday or so, Angela Merkel gave an interview and she explained that those who, in fact, created the condition for the conflict in Ukraine was, in fact, the Baltic states and Poland. Again, nothing really new, because that's something I wrote in my books already in 3 years ago. So nothing new there.
Isn't that amazing, Carl, that these Baltic states, how can they do that to Europe? It's unbelievable.
Well, I think I have mentioned that several times on your channel, but I when I was in NATO, I spent 5 years in NATO, and talking to my peers who were also colonels, but mostly from the so-called old Europe. I mean, France, Italy, Spain. I mean, the old, what Donald Rumsfeld called the old Europe. All of them had exactly the same feeling as I had. That means that, in fact, because the Baltic state and Poland were the real supporter, because those people, they were under communist rule for 50, 70 years, and they had very high expectations toward the US. And they were the strongest supporters of the US. Whatever the US can do, this is simply the Bible. Well, everything the Americans say is the Bible for them. And therefore, they received a lot of support from the US, because, on the other hand, they provided this kind of verbal and political support to the US position. When we talk about, for instance, and I talked about the old Europe, new Europe, in 2003, as the new Europe, or the old Europe, sorry, was discussing the issue of going to Iraq. I mean, discussing in the sense that they were very suspicious about the idea of going to Iraq. But, and that's hence the word of Donald Trump, the France and all that is old Europe. But the new Europe, the Eastern Europe, were those who followed the first contingent to be deployed in Iraq and all that, with the British and the Americans, were the Lithuanians, the Poland, the Ukrainians. You see, because those countries had dreamed. I don't dreamed or dreamt. I don't know. Anyway, they have dreamed about the US for so many years, so many decades, and today they are still the supporter. And within NATO, their voice is much stronger than in other places. And recently, you had this article in the Financial Times that talks about the Estonization of the EU policy. Estonization from Estonia. because you have a kind of radicalization of the EU uh, 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 policy that is driven by uh, uh, by the Baltic states, in essence. I mean, think about it. You have the European Union with about 30 different states, where you have very large ones like Germany, France, Spain, Italy. These are the engines of a European Union. But when it comes to select a delegate for foreign affairs, they don't take a French, an Italian, or no. They take an Estonian, Kaja Kallas, who comes from one of the tiniest states in Europe, with almost no knowledge whatsoever of the rest of the world. The only thing she knows is Russia. And when you hear about her, when you see her in interviews and all that, it's all about Russia. You can talk about the agreements with Mercosur, the South America, and all that. Inevitably, the discussion will end up to Russia with her. She knows nothing else in the world than Russia, because that's how they were educated in Estonia, to hate Russians, period. It's a 1.2 or 1.3 million people. And she is driving the foreign policy of Europe, which is about, I don't know, 550 million people. So, no, it doesn't make any sense. And that's where you see that they have, in effect, a disproportionate weight in policy making, in both in NATO and in EU, because these countries are the most adamant, most engaged supporter of the U.S. policy. That's so why, I mean, at least in NATO, I don't have exactly the same experience, because I've worked with the EU, but never within the EU. So I'm probably not able to discuss the mood within, or the mindset within Europe as such. I mean, I can see that from the outside, but not from an insider point of view. In NATO, I can say that from an insider point of view. The disproportionate interest for the in listening to these Baltic and Polish. In Baltic and Poland, they belong together somehow, and they have a disproportionate impact on policymaking, definitely. I mean, when I remember, for instance, what happened in 2014 in Ukraine. We received intelligence reports or what's happening on the ground and things like that. Everything came out of the Polish and Lithuanian intelligence. Period. And therefore, I mean, and I was amazed, because everything, I mean, what I saw coming in those reports was not matching the information we got from other sources. It was totally different, and of course, strongly biased against Russians. So there is definitely here a disproportionate impact of the Baltic and Polish states in those organizations. In any case, the problem in Europe is not simply just a question of energy and all that. There are a lot of problems. I mean, the management at large is a real problem. I mean, when you have, sorry. Sorry. When you have, as an example, I mean, again, I don't want to go deep into this topic, because this is not something that I'm very interested in. But when you have all the contracts for the vaccine and all that, which is just dealt directly by Ursula von der Leyen through SMS and texting, there is something wrong. When you have billions of euro just discussed or handled through SMS, this is not serious. There is a real management problem there, and the accountability of Mrs. von der Leyen is definitely in question here. So this is not the way you manage a continent. Let's put it that way. But when we go further, when we talk about, I mean, even what we have seen, we have discussed that, I think, on your channel, this agreement with Trump, we said it totally disproportionate, totally imbalanced. Uh, uh, how can you do something without any consultation, by the way? You see, and that shows that Mrs. von der Leyen, I think the problem is, and here we are back to probably things that are more, let's say, related to the way we manage things in the West. It's more the appearance than the content. That is, and we prefer to have a president of the commission, which is a woman, regardless of the competence, but it has to be a woman. The same for the for Kaya Kalas and all that. We're not looking for the result. We're not looking for the objective. We're not looking what we want to achieve. We're not looking about what is the ultimate goal, but it has to fill the appearance of something. So we have those persons who are obviously incapable. I mean, Ursula von der Leyen has been a catastrophe as defense minister in Germany. And I don't know anybody in Germany who sees Ursula von der Leyen as a successful defense minister. She was a catastrophe, and that's the reason, by the way, for Angela Merkel to send her to Europe, because they didn't want her anymore in the government. So we have somebody who is incompetent, notably incompetent, who is intellectually biased against Russia, and who obviously has never set a strategy to settle the problem in Ukraine. And that's the reason why today we have this political elite in Europe who are somehow taken by surprise, because today the narrative they had so far is crumbling, suddenly totally crumbles. And they have no response for that, because they never had a real strategy to address the problem. In fact, they had just a strategy to help Ukraine, period, but without knowing what they want to achieve. As a result, today they understand, because the US has understood that helping Ukraine is leading nowhere, and therefore Trump wants to get out of this conflict, because it's just about spending money and with no return on investment, leaving the European alone to support the conflict. And now the Europeans understand that they were not able to do that on their own. As a result, you have the Europeans. They are lost to some extent, because they don't know what they want to achieve. And this has been a consistent problem, and it's the problem you see with all the European elites. They think that governing is just simply being the boss and giving orders. It's more or less the same mentality as those who in the 16th century or 15th century were born as kings, and they received a crown, and they were just told to govern. But this was not their intent. They didn't know what to achieve. Fortunately, they had probably good advisors, which is today missing. But we are in a very similar situation today. And by the way, this explains why all these governments are failing in Germany, in France, in United Kingdom, and so on. They are failing. Their economy is failing. Everything is failing, and they are still talking about supporting Ukraine. But what for? What is the objective? What they want to reach? They have no objective, and they have no strategy. Because a strategy is simply to explain the way how to achieve an objective. So if you don't have an objective, you cannot have a strategy. This just makes sense. So now they are just trapped in their own narrative, and the narrative is the policy somehow. And that's exactly where we are. As a result, we have no and they have no reverse gear, as we say very often, meaning that they don't realize that there is probably a time where you need to think about the substance of the conflict, the substance of the solution, and probably it's a good time to think that maybe you have a solution that needs to be addressed not through providing weapons and funding to you don't know where. And if you just read what you had this article recently, yesterday or so, or yeah, in the New York Times, saying that money is flowing into Ukraine not based on what is needed, but on where you have the most inflated bill, because at the end it's simply to feed the corruption. So are we really helping Ukraine by feeding corruption? Probably not. So what are we doing? And if we are wise enough to understand that what we are doing is leading nowhere, we should probably choose or select another way, meaning that maybe talking, maybe dialogue with the Russians. And that's also what in fact, what the Vladimir Putin said in the Valdai conference, he mocked the Europeans for that, for not being able to change their mind and think to other solutions and try to understand that where they are going to is just going for the worse and not for the better. And that's exactly what he said when it was about when he talked about the specific Tomahawk missiles. He also pointed at the Americans, saying, well, if you give Tomahawk missiles, that will just destroy what you tried to start, starting rebuilding a kind of a relationship between US and Russia. And if you give missile, then all that will be destroyed. So then you will be back to square one. But if you listen the whole of what Vladimir Putin said on that occasion, you can see that somehow he mocked the Europeans for this inability, this intellectual inability to adjust to the situation, and being in fact trapped into a narrative and being unable to get out of this narrative in order to find a real solution to the problem. Because what you see daily on the ground, and what in fact even Vladimir Putin said at the Valdai meeting, Ukraine is getting every day worse, meaning that you can struggle, you can provide new weapons, you're providing this and that. The fact of the matter is that you are not improving the situation for the Ukrainians. You are just prolonging the war, and that's something that definitely the Europeans apparently are aiming at. But prolonging the war up to which point? Of course, if you listen to Zelensky, and he recently posted this tweet saying that the whole idea is now to create a situation that becomes more and more unsustainable for the Russians, and that eventually they will create some hunger riots, as Zelensky called them, and eventually destabilize the government. But the reality of what we observe in Russia is not this one. You don't see that the people are have a problem with the government. You don't see that. I mean, there are probably some in Russia who are unhappy with Putin's decisions, and that's certainly true, as you have in any country. But they're probably not a majority. and probably the majority of the Russians are okay with Putin's policy. And in fact, if you look at the polls, and I follow regularly the surveys done by the Levada Center, which is, by the way, considered as a foreign agent by the Russian authorities, and they make regular surveys on the satisfaction of the Russian people, and also, I mean, the satisfaction of the Putin's policies, one, but also how the Russians support the special military operation, and when you see all the result, and they do every month, they do the same survey, meaning that you can compare from one month to the other. And I follow that since the very beginning of the special military operation, so I can see the evolution. And you see that, in fact, the evolution remains exactly the same, meaning that the support, in fact, the support to Vladimir Putin has increased since the beginning of the operation. And of course, you have, as the Russian authorities themselves have said, that they support the idea of negotiation. And you see exactly the same trend in the population. They also support the idea of negotiation. And you have an increased number of people who want to develop negotiation in Russia, for instance. But on the other hand, when you talk about the support to the special military operation, to the military operations on the ground, you can see that this support is increasing. So you have, it sounds like paradoxical that you have first an increasing support, or stable, let's say, because there you have variations, but let's say a stable support to Vladimir Putin, like between 85-87% of the population supports Putin's policies. That's the more. When it's about a negotiation, you have more than 50% of the population in Russia who supports the idea of negotiation. And you have probably only 20% who support the idea of going just war. So but when it's about supporting the special military operation, you have 75% of the population that supports the special military operation. So it seemed contradicting the idea of negotiation, but in fact, it's not that. The thing is that the people support the idea that you have to protect the Russian population in Ukraine, and therefore they are in favor of the special military operation. On the other hand, they understand that it cannot go endless. It cannot be an endless war. And at one point, we have to go into a negotiation process, and that's a majority of the Russians are in favor of that. And in fact, it reflects exactly what you have from the Russian authorities. It's interesting because, on the other hand, when you look at the Europeans, I mean, European Union, they are against any dialogue with Russia. They oppose any dialogue. And they even advised Zelensky not to have a dialogue with Russia. And for them, it's about feeding the conflict, because they assume, or they think, that continuing the war will be at the end in favor of Ukraine.
Yes.
How, to what extent, nobody knows really, but that's how they feel it. So it's a very emotional approach to the conflict. It's not based on the fact you can observe on the battleground.
Exactly.
And this is but this is the way the Europeans see that. So, and again, we are talking about the Ukrainian conflict, but if you look at all the other problems you have in Europe, you can see that this is the approach of the European polity at large. It's wishful thinking from A to Z.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Thank you so much, Carl, for being with us today.
That was
Great
my
pleasure,
pleasure.
as
Thank you
always.
very much. Thank you.